The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, we're joined by our own managing editor, Cobus van Staden from Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, it has been a very busy week out here in Asia. U.S. President Joe Biden has been in town, and even before he arrived last week, if you recall, it was busy when he was hosting leaders from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in Washington for the U.S.-ASEAN Special Summit. So Asia has been the focus of attention. This week, though, we have seen the unveiling of the new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Program. This was meant to be the big challenge to China. In fact, let me just read you some of the headlines that we've been seeing out here. Reuters said, Biden in Japan to launch regional economic plan to counter Beijing. CNN said Biden unveils his economic plan for countering China in Asia. So you can see that the framing of this new IPEF plan is all about China. Let's take a listen to what Biden said in Tokyo when he took the veil off IPEF.
We're here today for one simple purpose. The future of the 21st century economy is going to be largely written in Indo-Pacific, in our region. The Indo-Pacific covers half the population of the world and more than 60% of the global GDP. And the nations represented here today, and those who will join this framework in the future, are signing up to work toward an economic vision that will deliver for all people, all our people. The vision for an Indo-Pacific that is free and open. Let's start with new rules governing trade and digital goods and services, so companies don't have to hand over the proprietary technology to do business in a country. Let's create a first-of-its-kind supply chain commitments to eliminate bottlenecks in critical supply chains and develop early warning systems so we can identify problems before they occur. And let's pursue other first-of-its-kind commitments to clean energy and decarbonization. The climate crisis is an existential threat that is costing us trillions in economic damage, but there's also incredible potential and opportunity to solve problems and create good jobs by transitioning to a clean energy economy.
So, Cobus, he made the case that the stakes are incredibly high for the Indo-Pacific. And for those of you who are not from the hinterlands of the Washington, D.C. Beltway, Indo-Pacific is what we out here in this part of the world called Asia, or Asia-Pacific. That's a U.S. thing. Nobody out here, by the way, calls it Indo-Pacific except the Americans. So that's a weird Americanism that they've done because they wanted to pivot away from Asia because I think there was too Chinese. I don't know what it was. But anyway, so you and I have been writing all week about how this IPEF thing is more or less, in our view, dead on arrival, and for a number of different reasons. First of all, out here in Vietnam, not a lot of enthusiasm. The state-controlled media out here, they were doing the perfunctory coverage, but you could tell just in the coverage, not a lot of enthusiasm for it. I wrote today to our subscribers 3 reasons why I think this is dead and not going to go anywhere. And Cobus, I'd like to get your take because I know you've been writing about this. Number 1, it does not provide any market access to the U.S. That's the thing that people are most interested in. It's not really fundamentally a trade deal because it doesn't provide any preferential access into the U.S. market. So one has to wonder, what's the point? Because that's what this country here in Vietnam and many of the Asian countries are trading countries. They want access. Vietnam now has 15 free trade agreements in place. So no market access is really not that appealing to most Asian countries. Also, let's take into account U.S. politics. It's going to take at least 18 months for the 13 countries that are participating in IPEF to negotiate a final deal. 18 months, by the way, is a very aggressive time frame. So let's say it takes 18 months to 2 years. That's going to put you right into the run-up of the U.S. presidential election and less than a year before a new American president sits in the Oval Office, assuming, of course, that Joe Biden is not going to run again, given his age. So the question is then, the memories are very fresh out here of what happened the last time that Asian countries bent over backwards to accommodate U.S. demands on labor, on environment, on technology, on intellectual property rights, all of that went into what's now known as CPTPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Those memories are fresh when Donald Trump came into office, and I think within the third or fourth day, he ripped up the agreement and withdrew the United States. TPP, by the way, moved on without the U.S., but they remember what happened. So I think people are very, very skeptical. Also bear in mind, Cobus, that this is probably not going to be congressionally ratified. It will be in an executive order, and that means the new president, whoever that may be, can simply come in and with the swipe of a pen, empty it out and say, we're not going to do it anymore. So again, another reason why countries may be more ambivalent. And then, of course, there is what I called the China thing. The U.S. is framing this as a confrontation to China, as we heard in those headlines. Countries like Vietnam, Southeast Asian countries, all but the big Northeast Asian countries in Korea and Japan, are very ambivalent, like most African countries, of getting stuck in the middle of a conflict between the United States and China. And bear in mind, China's economic influence here in Southeast Asia and throughout much of Asia Pacific is far bigger than the United States. So one has to wonder, why would you throw your chips down onto make a gamble or a bet on the IPEF when in fact the Chinese have something called RCEP, which is RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. That is their free trade agreement. They're trading much more with the Chinese than they are with the Americans. So again, all of these factors together, Cobus, make this just just a non-starter.
Yeah, there's also the additional, irony that now China, as you said, China is leading RCEP, and it's facilitating China's already enormous trade relationship with these countries. But China has also applied to join CPTPP. So it's we're facing the possibility that that this kind of bloc designed by the US to exclude China will be led by China soon. So it's very interesting. I agree with you that the fact that it doesn't include market access, I think, makes it something that a lot of these countries may not be that interested in, or not primarily interested in. I think the soundbite we featured from President Biden himself also made a secondary point there, that obviously a lot of this has been shaped by the experience of American companies in expanding to China, where they were forced by the Chinese government to turn over some intellectual property, and this is clearly designed to allow that to not happen again. But the problem is that I think developing countries, I think they take a lot of inspiration from the fact that China managed to leverage that much, intellectual property from Western companies. I think both ASEAN and African countries would love to have the ability to get intellectual property transfer from these companies, because so much of China's explosive development was based on that, or not only on that intellectual property itself, but the way that it then sparked additional innovation within China. So that, I would imagine, is another reason why they're not they don't seem super enthusiastic about it. The other issue then is also where the weight of all of this standard setting is going to land. Whether it will only land on, which, as a lot of people have said, that it will mostly land on the Southeast Asians rather than on the Americans. So again, there's a lot being asked of these countries with not that much sweetening the deal.
So the IPEF is just the latest in a long string of initiatives that are either directly, explicitly targeted at confronting China or indirectly targeted. Let me just refresh you on some of the past ones that we've had. Remember, there was the Clean Network, which was targeted at providing an alternative to Huawei and Chinese technology. Then there was the B3W, Build Back Better World. Again, I've mentioned this number of times on the show that we are fast approaching the 1-year anniversary to the announcement of B3W, and there's nothing to show for it. B3W was ostensibly intended to confront or to provide an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. There are any number of these different initiatives that are playing out, and time again, one of the consistent themes that we're seeing in this, and again, we're not trying to harp and be negative on the U.S., we just don't feel necessarily that they're rising to the challenge. But it's happening in many different parts of the world. Obviously, this week it's in Southeast Asia and Asia. We've seen this previously in Africa. That's where B3W aims to play out. And Huawei is another area where it's playing out worldwide, especially in regions like the Middle East. And that's why when we saw an article pass through the national interest, China is winning the Middle East data, cyber, and technology race by Mohammed Soliman, who is a non-resident scholar with the Middle East Institute's Emerging Tech Program and Egypt Program, and also a senior associate at the consulting firm McClarty Associates Middle East and North Africa practice. We took a lot of interest and rushed out to invite Mohammed on the show, and he joins us this morning from Washington, D.C. A very good morning to you.
Good morning. Good afternoon, I assume.
Yes, so it's good afternoon and good evening. We're coming from all over the world today, but we're so excited to have you on the program. This is something that I've been eager to do for a very, very long time. We're a big fan of yours and the work that you do. You heard the setup there about how the United States has been determined for a number of years to confront China's growing influence in the global south. It's done so with, I think, to be fair, mixed results at best. My assessment's probably far more skeptical about the U.S. performance overall. Your article seemed to be something of a warning to official Washington. And let me just quote here, okay? You said, quote, "Without fully integrating data, cyber, and technology into Middle East relations, the U.S. risks handing regional dominance to its greatest geopolitical foe." Let's start our conversation with that stark warning.
First of all, thanks so much for inviting me to your show. I really enjoy the work you do. It's fascinating, and I believe that you are one of the most influential podcasts in this space, so I really applaud you for the work you're doing. Let me start by your question, which is, I would say, a very, very important question. What I mean by integrating data, cyber, and tech into U.S. foreign policy broadly and Middle East in general. In the recent years, foreign policy had changed. It's not really centered around the usual bilateral relations around security, trade. Now it's more about 5G, data transfer. It's about tech capabilities. And the United States did not really do its own homework for the last 5, 6, 7 years. And this is why we ended up with the 5G situation. The United States allies and partners have been partnering with ZTE and Huawei to build their own 5G capabilities. And folks in Washington didn't really understand why, how, when did this happen. And there's a recognition that we're lagging behind. And when we start reacting to this, that was under the Trump administration with the Open Network Initiative, it was almost like a crackdown that also made our own partners and allies uncomfortable. Right now, we don't really have the luxury of just understanding our own relations with Middle Eastern countries from the normal traditional security lens. Tech is cornerstone. Tech is very fundamental to many of our own partners and allies' aspirations to be self-resilient, to be rising powers, to be economically independent. This is the new norm, and we need to acknowledge that. And we cannot really send diplomats to capitals around the world who do not really understand 5G, data transfer, autonomous vehicles, AI, the old normal Kissingerian model of a diplomat that speaks just a foreign language, and he's there to, or she's there to have a cocktail with an ex-ambassador or an ex-official. That model is already dead. We need people who understand the tech landscape, the geotech landscape, understand what's a whole semiconductor situation means for the United States and its own footing globally. So I know it's a long story. I know I have been talking about many subjects, but this is the framework. Tech is fundamental to U.S. foreign policy. Tech is fundamental to geopolitics. Therefore, we need to center tech to our own foreign policy preferences and our own strategic doctrine.
If we start with internet provision, there was this really kind of eye-popping moment a few years ago where, during the height of the Trump era kind of crackdown on Huawei and a lot of pressure being put on global South governments, to choose sides, where the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, had this moment where he said in an interview, like, well, the United States is just jealous of Huawei's achievements in 5G and that they can't match it. And kind of it elicited an angry response from Washington. But I was wondering where we're standing in the 5G, 6G, 7G race now between the United States and Western allies and China. Like, what is the kind of like, where are we in the moment of technological development in that field?
One of the problems that the United States has in general is there's nothing called USA Inc. There's a China Inc. You can basically bring Huawei, ZTE, and they come with their own financing, they come with their own technical background, and the diplomatic might of China. But in the United States, you don't really have that. You don't really have a China, you don't have a United States Inc., a national champion that you can point to and say, okay, this is an American national champion that's going to bring Washington, that's going to bring all the American power, American geoeconomic muscle behind X project. America doesn't really have that. That's not really how the American model works. In terms of the 5G race, we don't really have the equivalent of Huawei, and that was one of the problems, right? One of the problems that the United States has in the Huawei, in the 5G race, you don't really have a U.S. company that compete in general. And then you ended up with some laughable or some policy recommendations, for instance, during the Trump administration about the United States buying either Nokia or Ericsson and transform them into American champions who can compete in the space. Of course, that proposal did not really fly. And then we ended up with the Open Network Initiative, which was a State Department initiative that's telling allies and partners, you need to exclude Huawei from your own network. And I think the strategy at that time was to prevent the main partners, the main allies to the United States, from having Huawei in their own 5G, because that might have an impact on national security impact on intelligence sharing about military installations. In the case of Israel, in the case of UK, in the case of France. On the long term, there was another emphasis coming from Washington on investing in R&D with Quad, with Japan, with India, trying to develop some more indigenous 6G capabilities on the long term. But that's it. I don't really see more movement into that track right now. We know that Huawei got hammered. We know that Huawei lost a lot of its own cloud because of the U.S. sanctions. But that doesn't mean that the United States filled the gap that already exists that allowed Huawei to be where it is right now.
Just to clarify, do you mean that only in terms of the expansion into the world and the kind of network building that Huawei was doing, or also in terms of the actual race to improve the technology itself? So is there also not a US kind of actor like a Google or someone who's like kind of racing ahead in the 6G and 7G direction?
Yes, that's correct.
Would you mind kind of explaining that to me, like how that works commercially? Like aren't the kind of Googles, Apples, and so on of Silicon Valley also in competition with each other to try and just be the kind of market innovator on just for their own sake in the US market? So is there not that have those market forces not managed to kind of push that level of innovation on the US side as people would have expected it would?
Part of what you were talking about is a reflection of a broader situation in the United States. Tech is perceived as bad for political reasons. And right now there is a tendency to fight big tech. Like big tech right now is not perceived as really American companies. They're perceived as global companies. Therefore, there are some voices on the left and on the right that want to punish big tech. So we are seeing a lot of regulations from data transfer, which is very essential to AI and development of these companies' models, to taxation, to even not helping with the whole H-1B immigration situation, tech really is under a lot of scrutiny in the United States. And that started to impact the United States positioning when it comes to geotechnology around the globe. And people here have been talking about the fact that in great power competition, you cannot really afford to alienate your tech companies, and there's no strategic. But, American political discourse right now is going through a very difficult time, to say the least.
That is definitely an understatement, no doubt. Let's go back to the Middle East. Help us contextualize how tech factors into the broader power shift that appears to be underway in the Middle East, whereby there is a perception, and again, U.S. officials do counter this perception. They disagree with it vehemently, that the United States is losing interest in the Middle East, particularly the Persian Gulf. It's intending to pull back a little bit. The Chinese are moving in. We do know that Chinese economic engagement in the Persian Gulf in particular has gone up considerably. Chinese diplomatic engagement, the Chinese have even offered to mediate parts of the Arab-Israeli conflict. There's a lot more presence of the Chinese in the Middle East. There's a special envoy that's been making the rounds. Help us put tech in the broader context between the United States and China in the Middle East and Persian Gulf.
This is a very excellent question. So there are two parts to your question. The first part is the one about U.S. military footprint engagement with the region broadly, and the second one is more about tech. For the first part, here in Washington, everyone say, do not believe the perceptions, do not really believe the headlines. America is in the Middle East. We are not going anywhere. We have and we maintain the same military footprint. That's easier said than done. What I mean by that, the Carter Doctrine that dominated the U.S. engagement in the Gulf, for example, is dead, right? When Iranian missiles or Iranian attack on Aramco, on the oil facilities in Saudi Arabia in 2019, and the United States did not respond, that was perceived as death to the Carter Doctrine.
Sorry to interrupt you. Can I ask you just to briefly explain what is the Carter Doctrine?
And Carter Doctrine was mainly the United States is committed to the defense of the Gulf countries and making sure there's no other great power that dominate the energy sources of the Gulf. And that definitely started in 1980s height of the Cold War. And after that, that was the Kuwait, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and the United States gathered a coalition to expel the Iraqi forces and Desert Storm and the rest of the story. And that doctrine dominated or basically framed the U.S. engagement with the Gulf for the arguably last 40 years. And in 2019, when the RJC, when Iran attacked Saudi oil facilities in Abqaiq and Kharais, and the United States did not respond, that was perceived as there's no Carter Doctrine anymore. There's no U.S. security commitment to the defense of the Gulf in times of attack, and that also means that these oil-producing nations are vulnerable because their own security guarantor is actually not really acting as a guarantor anymore. They maintain the same military footprint, but these U.S. forces are not really being in use, and that created, I would say, shockwaves. Meaning Abu Dhabi or Riyadh started to look for no alternatives to the United States, but they're looking for them to be self-reliant. It's not a binary question between China and the United States. I somehow disagree with that connotation. In the Middle East, and I would say around the world, countries want to be resilient. And that's a reflection of many factors. Number one, no one wants to be a pawn in another Cold War. Number two, no one, after seeing what happened in COVID-19 and the vulnerability of supply chain, no one wants to be reliant on foreign suppliers, even if they are great powers. And number three, populations want to be in resilient countries, resilient states that are immune to shocks of the global geopolitical landscape. So what does it mean in the Gulf? It means if we have the finances, if we have the financial capabilities, why wouldn't we start building our own domestic/indigenous capabilities that will allow us to be independent and resilient and able to confront threats that basically threaten our own safety and security? And this is what the Saudis and the Emiratis have been doing. They have been investing heavily in their own tech capabilities. I mean, the Emiratis already are developing their own drones, have been working extensively on building their own indigenous industry. They're pioneer in using AI on commercial scale, deploying. They're also trying to invest in Open RAN 5G, basically trying to diversify their 5G ecosystem. So they also try to avoid any potential U.S. sanctions or any sort of another crackdown on Chinese equipment. They are trying to have tech partnerships with countries like India and Israel. So they're investing heavily. Same thing in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is going through one of the most fascinating digital transformation I have seen. When I go to Saudi Arabia almost every 2 months, the country has an fascinating digital/data ecosystem. They're deploying 5G in a faster scale. They're trying to invest in smart cities. They're also building their own drone capabilities. They're trying to build anti-drone capabilities to counter the Houthi attacks coming from Yemen. So you are seeing a lot of different trends in the Gulf. And these trends are not really per se choosing China over the United States. It's more of choosing themselves. They're trying to build their own capabilities. And that's the message that I believe they're trying to give to Washington. Not think about what we're doing as a choice. It's more of us trying to be resilient.
But that's a very difficult choice for many people in Washington to accept, simply because there is an us versus them mentality that if you're working with the Chinese, then you're not working with us. And you talked about all the different things that the Saudis are doing in terms of building their own weapons, their own drones. A lot of that is being done with Chinese technology, Chinese support, and Chinese advice. So I think the Americans may interpret that as a pivot away from the traditional partnership with the United States towards more close alignment with the Chinese.
Let me add a tweak here. I would say Saudi Arabia is working with a lot of international partners. I mean, Saudi Arabia, France is a very, very major player in the military equipment space in the Gulf. And this is a U.S. ally. This is a fundamental NATO member. Same thing applies to UK, applies to Italy. I would even say that Korea, Japan, and India are rising players in the Gulf as partners, as allies, as countries that are willing to have co-production, exchange tech, exchange capabilities. Same thing also applies to China and Russia. So it's not really just China. It is multiple countries, multiple partners that the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Egyptians and the Algerians and many countries are engaging with them. And this is a new norm. They believe that not everything has to go through the binary length of Washington, which is basically either us or them. Because again, we are not in 1990s anymore. This is not end of history. This is not Fukuyama end of history. Liberal democracy has prevailed and Washington is the most dominant force on planet Earth. That's not true. That's not factually is not true. America doesn't have a dominant the same dominant position that it maintained after the end of the Second World War and in the 10 years or 15 years after the end of the Cold War. That's not the case. And alliance and partners understand that, and they're trying to hedge by building their own resiliency and having bilateral relations with many of the rising middle powers on the global level. And this is what we're seeing. This is why you see Turkey as an active player, Korea, Japan, India, France, UK, Germany, of course, Russia and China. Every one of these countries, they are trying to build bilateral relations, trilateral relations and understandings. So they prepare themselves for a reality where Washington cannot come to the rescue because Washington is either very constrained because of political situation inside the country, or because honestly, America is already overstretched. And even when America makes some commitments, it doesn't really mean that America has the capabilities to fulfill these commitments.
So in the paper, you make the point that on some issues, these rising kind of tech powers in the Middle East are actually quite well aligned with China or wider Chinese tech thinking. And one example is data sovereignty. So for people who haven't been following this debate, data sovereignty is kind of shorthand for China's idea that the internet should be run, that national governments should have a say about about the internet, and that data should be stored locally. So it's a move towards a kind of a national internet rather than the American model of a global kind of like free and open internet. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about that trend and kind of what the thinking is among these governments about these kind of counter ideas that are coming from China.
This is a very excellent question. Data sovereignty / data nationalism is a reflection of what happened in 2016 in the Russian intervention in the US election through data manipulation. And the first iteration of a global reaction to this, the Cambridge Analytica scandal and the Russian interference in the election, was the EU launching GDPR. Forgive me that I do not remember what stands for, but it's an EU framework on regulating data that safeguards EU nationals' data and trying to make sure that the citizens of Europe have access and control over their own data, and it's not really being transferred and processed overseas in a way that would threaten or jeopardize their own data security. And what happened is the EU, as a regulatory superpower, impacted the global perception of data. So the story, in my opinion, is somehow different. People started replicating or taking the EU GDPR as a model for the data framework. And this is the Indian model right now. This is Turkey. This is Egypt, Saudi. Countries have their own concerns about some use of data, the use of their own national citizens' data, and how it's being processed overseas. So I wouldn't really just put it in the bucket of authoritarianism. I would put it much more on the fact that internet and tech became another domain where nation states want to exert their own influence and their own right as sovereign and sovereign nations, and they're trying to protect their citizens' data, or for other reasons. I also understand that. Not everyone here wants data for protection, also for misuse. But that's a global trend. The global trend is that data is being used as an asset, also being treated as a national security component that should be within the boundaries of a nation state.
And of course, that's a common issue in much of the Middle East and the Persian Gulf that are mostly undemocratic. So it is a hallmark of authoritarian governments to want to control speech. And those internet sovereignty laws play nicely with all of that. So certainly in Iran, that's the issue. I think UAE has some speech controls on what can be done in Saudi Arabia as well. So those all kind of intersect. I want to go back to your paper. And you wrote that you said here that the United States should condition military support, intelligence sharing, and development aid for allied nations on excluding Huawei and other Chinese firms from their infrastructure. And when I read that, I read that a couple of times because I was like, okay, well, that basically wipes out the entire global South. And again, it's a weird thing to say only because, as you pointed out in the beginning of our discussion, the U.S. doesn't have an alternative. It has Nokia, Samsung, Ericsson. Those are European and Korean alternatives, but it doesn't have an American alternative. So it goes up to country X, and as you're saying, it says, if you have Huawei, then we don't do military support, intelligence sharing, and development aid. That's it. Take it. Country X then turns around and said, okay, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to rip out $50 million worth of Huawei networking gear out of my network right now? And then what do I do? Are you going to give me $50 million to replace it, which is probably going to be $150 million, given the fact that there's a lot of other costs that come with it? So let's get down to brass tacks about your recommendation and what a country, particularly in the global South, is supposed to do when confronted by that American ultimatum.
No, this is an excellent point. So I have two reactions here. Number one, I think when I wrote this in my mind, I was mostly focused on partners, not every country, because again, America at this point is not really engaging with whole regions. They are engaging with pivotal countries, and we can name them, right? So in Africa, they care about Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Nigeria, of course, Ethiopia. So you can name specific pivotal countries. What's a model that America should follow? I think the Trump administration, specifically under Secretary Pompeo, they provided a model that could be replicated if it is within concerted effort. And what's that? So USAID subsidized or provided President Bolsonaro, with, I would say, I remember 1.1 or 1.2 billion dollar to help Brazil finance or fill the financial gap between the cost of having Huawei building Brazil 5G or having the option of Nokia or Ericsson. So instead of telling developing countries who do not have the financial capabilities and they want to get Huawei because Huawei is 45%, 50% cheaper, and instead of just telling them just exclude Huawei, no, you're telling them, listen, this is going to be part of our own development package. We want to help you build your own 5G. We don't have our own 5G company, but there are other trusted vendors we believe are good options that you can choose from. And this was the entire philosophy behind the Open Network Initiative. And we are willing to step up our financial support and financial help for you to fill that gap. And again, that shouldn't be the model to be followed around the world and with every single country. Because again, there are countries that are perceived as a strategic asset for Washington that you cannot really afford having them part of a different sphere of interest or under Chinese influence. And this is the whole essence of that recommendation.
The problem with the thinking, and just allow me to challenge that, is that the Chinese oftentimes come in with conditionalities. Do you want big, huge development package X, then you also have to take Huawei Y. And those are linked. So for a lot of countries, they'll say, I can't pass up all of this other financing. I have to go with the Chinese. And the U.S. is coming in very, very siloed and segmented. So it's the State Department that comes in under Pompeo, as he did back in the day, and says, okay, we'll talk to you about Huawei. But other departments aren't coordinating with each other. As you talked about, the Chinese have China Inc., and that's a very formidable contender with the United States. How is a partner country, and we saw this in the United Arab Emirates with the F-35 issue, where the United States was very concerned about the relationship that the UAE has with China and that technology and intelligence from the F-35 may fall into the hands of the Chinese. And the United States put a lot of pressure on the Emirates about this. You know, when the Emirates said, forget it, keep it, we'll get something else. So even partner countries are willing to push back on that. So I'm wondering, again, what's the answer to the China Inc. question that you brought up when they come in with all of this package offers that are very difficult for many global South and middle power countries to refuse?
I am with you. I cannot push back here. I am with you on every single point you raised. We lack USA Inc. We don't have USA Inc. I don't believe that this is on the horizon. The response to this is usually we need more dynamic / agile interagency coordination mechanism that allow the U.S. government as a whole acting in concerted effort. But do I see this feasible? Like we keep seeing the same recommendation, and we hope in one administration that would be reality. But the problem is, and I agree with you, the U.S. government is far away from being perfect and lagging behind in terms of having coordinating mechanism to act and try to coordinate. I mean, and there's no other prime example than what you talked about, the F-35 proposed sale to the UAE that was completely stalled or, again, postponed. That's a code name for canceling the deal. And yes, this is what caused the U.S. partners and allies to be very skeptical from Washington when Washington makes commitments.
I was wondering where you feel we are now in this kind of much hype, kind of like tech decoupling that's been, kind of many people have discussed, but I think many people have also acknowledged that it's going to be very difficult to do, and that that even like. I think it's changing a little bit now, but like even at moments where the political discourse from the United States was extremely hawkish about China, like we saw, kind of big business or like big corporations in the US still kind of like do a lot of business with China and like even double down on some of their work in China. How do you feel that's going in the first place, and how do you feel that changes within China, particularly the kind of the crackdown on Chinese tech companies and other kind of changes in direction that seem to be emerging from this moment of the Xi Jinping administration? How do you feel that with all of these things in play, how is a tech decoupling going to go in the next few years?
I agree with the voices that say that complete tech decoupling is unfeasible, even though we are in a low point in the era of globalization. The globalization is going through a tough time, but the world is already integrated. I'm not saying the world is flat, but we're already integrated in terms of supply chain. It's very hard for me to see full decoupling when it comes to supply chain, or full decoupling from tech platforms. It's very, very difficult to see that. Maybe in some critical components of the tech ecosystem, maybe. Of course, 5G, I think 5G became the hardware of the internet is going to be a battle, a geopolitical battle between United States and its own allies and versus China/Russia. Semiconductors is also going to be part of that kind of decoupling tech that's going through decoupling phase. But other tech, very hard to see that. Very hard to see that. And aiming for full decoupling is not only unfeasible, it might be self-defeating in my own assessment. I think we're going through partial decoupling in terms of, let's say, DD is about to be delisted from New York Exchange, right? That's part of it. Or you have Airbnb shutting down its own operations in China. That's part of it. Same thing applies to LinkedIn. So you're going to see that sort of some American champions / some Chinese champions have limited access to each country's market, limited investment, cross investment between China and the United States, limited cooperation in terms of R&D and co-production. Also, the companies would be very, very concerned about patents and co-production. I would say these are going to be part of this partial decoupling between the United States and China on tech.
We started our conversation talking about how your article, in my view, was a warning for official Washington about the status quo today in the Middle East. And I'm curious, when you talk to U.S. stakeholders, as you do in your job in Washington, what's the reaction that you got from the National Interest article? And by the way, for those of people not familiar with the National Interest, not a liberal left-leaning publication. This is a national security publication that tends to be on the more conservative side, if anything. So here you are kind of waving your hand going, hey, everybody, you got to pay attention to what's going on over here. What's been the reaction that you've gotten from folks in Washington?
It depends on who you're talking to. I have been talking to some stakeholders who are very aware that we are lagging on tech. We don't really understand tech. Tech should be a cornerstone to our own foreign policy engagements. But then you are speaking to other stakeholders who believe that this is just an exaggeration. It's just another call, another false flag. We don't see this as a lost cause, or we're not that behind. So it depends on who you're talking to.
And let me guess, the people who are more sophisticated about it tend to be the practitioners, and the people who dismiss the concern tend to be more politically oriented. Is that a fair assessment?
This is a perfect assessment of what I have been going through. And on top of that, tech companies have been trying to sound the alarm about how tech should be a very important component of U.S. bilateral engagements with many countries around the world. But official Washington is still, again, the whole animosity with the tech companies since 2016, it's just making all these engagements toxic. And there's mistrust between the Valley and Washington, between Silicon Valley and Washington. And we need to work on that. Because again, in great power competition, you cannot afford to alienate your own tech companies, because geopolitics is not only about boots on the grounds, but also it's about wires and data and tech, and you need to be in line with your own tech companies on this front. Also, another point is maybe we need different foreign policy professionals with different skills. You need maybe foreign policy professionals who understand, who have technical background. They understand the AI from a technical / engineering standpoint, but then they studied IR, they understand IR theory, and they're able to mix both together. So we're able to have policy professionals who are able to come up with the right analysis, therefore the right conclusions, therefore we're getting a right action plan to deal with the situation.
Regrettably, Mohammed, the vast majority of the people who listen to this show fall into the category of sophisticated practitioners and not the idiot politicians. So I don't think we have too many of our politicians. In terms of you suggesting that the Americans need to fix their distrust of tech, it's hard to see that happen when the fact is that the Republican Party has basically vilified tech to the point where they look at it as the enemy of all enemies, in many ways worse than everybody else. I mean, if you listen to Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell and those folks, what they talk about Twitter and Facebook, and it's all part of the radical left. It seems very difficult to find unity on that issue in the United States today, given the bitter divides that exist there. The article is China is winning the Middle East data, cyber, and technology race. It literally could not be spelling out the warning and that statement more clearly, written by Mohammed Soliman, who is a non-resident scholar with the Middle East Institute's Emerging Tech Program and Egypt Program, and also a senior associate at the consulting firm McClarty Associates Middle East and North Africa practice. The article is in the national interest. We'll put links to it and some of Mohammed's other excellent writing in the show notes, so you can click below. Mohammed, thank you so much for taking the time today to walk us through all your thinking on this. You are very active on Twitter, and you have a wonderful Twitter feed. What is your handle so people can find you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. My handle is Soliman.
And I will put a link to Mohammed's Twitter handle in the show notes below. Mohammed, thank you so much again. We appreciate you getting up early for us today, and really look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thank you, sir. The pleasure is mine. Thank you, gentlemen.
Cobus, Mohammed's article and his other writings are absolutely essential reading. And he, again, is sounding this alarm in Washington that unfortunately not enough people are paying attention to. And you see this in the press coverage of the IPEF. Like, they're taking this seriously as if it's another program that's going to work. And one of the things that we have seen over the years is that these U.S. efforts are not backed up with solid policy. They're not backed up with real muscle behind it. And the United States will sometimes put out this line that says, well, we're not going to compete with the Chinese dollar for dollar. Okay, but you got to show up with something. And money does matter here, because money is clout. I mean, that's the same in all politics everywhere. So if you're not going to show up with money and you're not going to have creative policymaking, you got to have something. And I think what Mohammed's doing is saying we got to bring some expertise. But at the same time, the death of expertise is a real phenomenon in the United States. We don't celebrate specialists anymore. This was on very full display during the whole COVID fiasco in the United States, where it was the experts fighting against the political interests and fighting against Fox News and Tucker Carlson. And that was just over and over and over again. We see this play out. So I'm not entirely sure that his call for more expertise in the foreign policy circles to be able to talk tech is going to solve this problem. Frankly, I'm just not sure, based on what I've seen, that the United States is truly up for the challenge that it's facing, both with the rise of the rest, as they say, in terms of all of these new emerging powers that are there, and at the same time to confront China. The last point that I'll make on this, going back to the U.S.-ASEAN summit, the United States kicked up $150 million. $150 million. And you heard Biden talk about how Asia is the most important region in the world. This is where the showdown with the Chinese is taking place. The economies on the front line of that are here in Southeast Asia, and all they've got is $150 million. I checked that my county, Alameda County, where I'm from in the Bay Area, gets more than $150 million a month from the federal government on any given month. So we're basically saying that this existential challenge that people like Senator Tom Cotton will tell you that we're facing with the Chinese is worth only $150 million. I don't get it. I don't get it. And I don't understand IPEF. I don't understand clean network. I don't understand B3W. And I certainly don't understand $150 million to ASEAN, 10 ASEAN countries, as some kind of symbol. Even if you're not going to match the Chinese dollar for dollar. Literally, the Chinese came in last November with a $1.5 billion package for Southeast Asia. So a 1 to 10 ratio is not really competing.
I think these are all really, really important points. It strikes me sometimes that China and the US is a little bit similar in the sense that that they tend to start with the announcement of a big initiative. There's many kind of huge initiatives that get announced, and then the kind of it's a kind of I'm sure there's someone who's a better kind of knowledge of Mandarin, maybe you who has a better a better idiom, but it reminds me a little bit of the idiom that's frequently used in relation to special economic zones, in the sense of like you build the nest and then the phoenix will come. There's an aspect there. You kind of make the announcement and then the kind of the details will fall into place. The problem is with the Chinese, on the Chinese side, like once that announcement is made, that sets the direction for many, many kind of state, semi-state and private actors who then kind of like compete with each other to kind of fall in line and kind of and put their own spin on this kind of broad direction that was announced. On the US side, that's not the situation. It's not a situation that Google jumps the moment when the US president speaks. So there, I think the kind of the gap becomes a bit more glaring, and then one of the gaps that then becomes quite big is the difference between the US as a set of armed forces around the world and the US as a commercial actor. And both of those are incredibly powerful, but they seem to be kind of powerful in different places in different ways, that don't necessarily work together. And in a lot of ways that's a good thing, right? Kind of like because that kind of like seamless monolithic aspect of of Chinese power can be a scary aspect of Chinese power too, depending on where you sit in relation to it. But on the US side, it does make for less coherence and a more kind of chaotic field of actors.
And let's just be very clear here. Just because we're criticizing the US for so much of its own mediocrity and its inability to execute doesn't mean that we're suggesting, or at least I'm not suggesting, that the Chinese are somehow doing it better. I mean, the Chinese have a reverse problem, as you pointed out, Cobus, so the United States will oftentimes, they'll announce these big plans and then don't follow through. The Chinese do something similar as well. Like even with FOCAC, these huge $60 billion packages that they did in, what was it, correct me if I'm wrong, it was 16 and 20, I think it was.
2015 and 2015.
Yeah, 15 and 2019. Oh, 2018, that's right. Those were the two $60 billion years. They only used about $40 billion of that. They didn't use the full $60 billion. And this is typical in a lot of Chinese plans where they'll announce a huge giant number and then don't fulfill it. Or they'll announce these MOUs, these memorandums of understanding, which have no backing or legal weight of any kind, and nothing ever happens to them. But they get the credit for doing things that they don't actually do. So there's another issue on the Chinese side that's there. And that's worthy of further exploration as well, that they're full of hype as well, and that's equally toxic because it doesn't really fulfill what they're saying they're going to do. But on the American side, I guess the frustration, though, over and over again, is that they keep doing the same thing, and everybody keeps believing them. I'm so frustrated reading the press coverage that every time there's one of these new acronym announcements, IPEF, B3W, whatever you want, people take it seriously as if it's going to work. And there just isn't any track record or evidence that the United States is good at doing this. And the frustrating part to watch it from afar is that all the pieces that are necessary to build an effective policy are there. Huge amounts of development aid. They have an Exim Bank. They've got all the tools. They've got the DFC. They've got, again, a very robust private sector. They've got a lot of great tools that if they just pulled it together. But the problem is they've got a sclerotic policymaking process. And who was that Singaporean minister we read the book? Kishore Mahbubani, what's his name? Is that guy?
Yeah. Kishore Mahbubani.
Yeah, he made this very interesting observation in his book. He said that in the old days, it was seen that the Soviets were old and sclerotic, and the Americans were young and dynamic in their policymaking process. But today, the perception is, whether it's true or not, again, this is at least just according to him, is that the United States is old and sclerotic. And it's the Chinese who are far more dynamic in their policymaking process. So I think, to Mohammed's point, if we focus on a more dynamic, less sclerotic policymaking process that can bring together these various assets, that might be the pathway out of mediocrity.
Maybe. I mean, for me, I have a slightly different reading of that Mahbubani quote, and kind of in general terms, I agree, kind of wholeheartedly. I guess what I'd add is that one of the dynamism on the Chinese side, or the current dynamism, and who knows what's happening in relation to tech in China at the moment. We're in a very kind of up in the air moment, But as we've seen China over the last 10 years at least, like one of the aspects of the dynamism, I think, or one of the aspects underlying the dynamism is that they come from a developmentalist place. So development, kind of is lots of things, but it's also among other things a story. It's a story of a place you were and then a place you're going to. And that means not only that China has a very powerful narrative to tell in the rest of the world, about its own development, that it also provides a kind of organizing principle for the Chinese themselves to move forward, but it's also means that they're on the same page with lots of other countries who are trying to achieve the same thing. And that is something that I was actually thinking about when Mohammed was mentioning these particularly strategic countries, or countries with particular strategic importance to the United States, and that they should be the focus of this kind of strategic tech thinking, particularly also trying to kind of keep them out of Chinese tech networks and in other networks, is that, in order to do that, one has to take these countries, you have to feel these countries like need to develop in some kind of fundamental way. And I don't know that the Americans really, and this, I'm not mean to single out the Americans for themselves. I think this is true for Europeans and for the rest of the global north too. They don't feel that need to develop on their skins, right? Kind of like they don't feel that real desperation for development, that powered Chinese success, and which means that they frequently, I think, are a little bit indifferent to the development trajectories of certain countries. So for them it becomes a really the main thing is we need to keep Chinese internet out of these countries, not how are these countries going to get the internet. Which is these countries' own preoccupation. And I think there is one of the real kind of differences between the two, and that I think it underlies it provides one of the kind of clues of why a lot of these countries keep working with China, even as China.
And that, of course, is not uniquely an American issue. The Canadians, the Australians, the Kiwis, the Europeans, the Japanese, the Koreans.
It's the result of being already developed.
That's right.
Of where your development trajectory lies outside of living memory. But, I think there's a second part there, which is that, and I think this is where it kind of complicates the American position itself, is that America itself, within America, is no stranger to systemic underdevelopment. Flint, Michigan exists, right? There are parts of the US where systemic underdevelopment in a way that would be familiar to people in the global South is still a reality, but that is part of it's baked into the particular history of the US, and that's, again, it's not only the US. This is true for Europe, it's true for many other places, many other rich countries too. But it complicates the kind of narrative that the United States wants to tell, which is one of being excellent at everything, and the global South, they're not kind of blind to those realities, and it complicates then the kind of the messaging that comes out of the US at the same time.
So we've been coming back to the US-China rivalry quite a bit in 2022, more than we had expected to, but I think it's just a sign of the times. This is the moment that we're in today. And I think we're going to have to keep coming back to these great power issues simply because the war in Ukraine has changed the dynamic of it. Also, the intensifying conflict between the United States and China. It's hard to talk about any possible cooperation between these two, Cobus, when the topic of discussion this week was whether or not Joe Biden was serious about coming to the defense of Taiwan in the event of a war with China. I mean, that is the rhetoric of where we are today. And so that's one of the reasons why we're going to continue looking at the U.S.-China relationship and where the Global South fits within all of that. So we hope that you will stay with us. And of course, all of this is being covered every single day on our site. And we have a team of 6 editors in Africa and Asia, all from the Global South, providing perspectives on the Global South in Arabic, French, and in English. We would love for you to join our community of readers. You can go to our website. You can see all the language sites that are there. By the way, the French and the Arabic sites are going to be closing up for the paywalls will start coming in pretty soon because we do want to make these sustainable businesses in order to support the independent journalists who produce this content every week for you. And so we would love for you to join us. You can go to China Global South. You can go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe, and you'll see all of our subscription options there. If you would just like to support the show and to get a weekly digest, you don't really want to get all the full everyday coverage, you can go to our Patreon page at patreon.com/China Africa Project. So that'll do it for this edition of the program. We're so grateful that you joined us all the way until the end. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another episode. For Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and Afriquechine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.